As 1987 began, Yayo's organization had a monopoly on the radius of streets and avenues around Audubon Ave and the 170s. Dealers under Yayo and the Ramos brothers were selling the baseballs, Lido, and Conan brands at nearly every intersection there. Business was also doing well at their nearby spots in the Bronx. Baseballs was by far the most profitable and earned tremendous revenue, pulling in anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000 in a single day, selling as many as 10,000 red top vials. Through his currency exchange, Yayo wired drug cash on a weekly basis to the Dominican Republic and continually expanded on his investments there. As Dominicans continued to run the crack and cocaine trade in Washington Heights, the area had deteriorated into a chaotic war zone full of drug gangs intent on protecting their territory. The majority of the gang members came from the Dominican cities of Santiago, San Francisco de Macorís, and the capital, Santo Domingo. Names of individuals who came from San Francisco de Macorís often came up in drug investigations, to the point that the police were speaking of a San Francisco cartel. Yayo and the Ramos brothers continued to fiercely protect their turf and punish anybody who infiltrated on their business. When the Ramoses discovered that several men outside of their crew were selling vials that falsely contained the Lido label, people were sent to beat them down with baseball bats. Amidst the full-blown crisis, the 34th precinct struggled to contain the turmoil brought on by the rampant drug activity. There were members of crews selling on nearly every corner, and turf wars between rival drug gangs were raging, leaving scores of dead bodies in their wake. In 1986, the 34th precinct was the city's deadliest command, leading the homicide rate with 72 murders. The overwhelming majority of those killed were Dominican drug gang members, with most of the homicides being carried out by hitmen imported from DR. On one occasion, a freelance Dominican drug dealer who had encroached on another crew's turf was held hostage and forced to watch his wife be disemboweled before he was killed with a shotgun blast to the head. News outlets had dubbed Washington Heights as both the cocaine and murder capital of New York City. But all of the police's efforts weren't in vain. They consistently made arrests of street dealers, several of whom belonged to the baseballs and Lido rings. Yayo, knowing that arrests were the price of doing business, quickly mended the situation by replacing the busted sellers with new ones. But several of those arrested had began cooperating with authorities, which were helping them close in on the men running the show behind the scenes. Yayo was still spending much of his time in the Dominican Republic and relied on his family and managers to run things, and returned to New York every so often to handle matters as needed. As crack wreaked havoc on the urban communities of many large American cities, there came those looking to profit off of it, and others would one day join Yayo in urban lore for their careers as crack kingpins. Some of those people included Freeway Ricky Ross from Los Angeles, who was a trailblazer during the drugs' rise in the city, and by 1986 he was also mass marketing around LA and other parts of the country. Then there was Rayful Edmond in DC, who was thought to be largely responsible for introducing the substance to the city. And the Chambers brothers from Detroit, who used an entire apartment building as the base of their operation. To help combat the problem, US President Ronald Reagan's legislation passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which boosted funding for law enforcement's narcotics divisions and greatly increased the penalties for crack dealing by implementing what's known as the 100-to-1 rule. That meant if someone was caught selling at least 50 grams of rocks, about the weight of a candy bar, they would receive a 10-year prison sentence. But anyone selling cocaine would have to be caught with over 100 times that, or 5,000 grams, enough to fill a briefcase, in order to get the same sentence. The act also focused on spreading awareness to the dangers of drugs through youth campaigns such as Just Say No.
Team up, say no to drugs.
Be smart, team up, say no to drugs.
Say it,
Say no to drugs.
Shake some sense into you kids that are using drugs and thinking about using. Don't.
These measures came to be known as the War on Drugs, which was a polarizing issue due to what many considered to be excessive targeting of minorities. The epidemic was a steady topic in American media, with barely a day passing by without a story related to it. With news outlets mainly focusing on reports regarding minorities in poor urban neighborhoods, it distracted attention from the fact that the drug was also being used by the middle class and many white Americans. The physical effects of chronic crack use were now being realized by many addicts, with symptoms including extreme weight loss, pulmonary complications, liver and kidney damage, and enamel decay leading to tooth loss. There was now a name etched in the American vernacular to refer to those addicted to the drug. They became instantly identifiable from their disoriented mannerisms as well as their physical features, which included a disheveled and gaunt appearance and oftentimes missing teeth. They also had the reputation of having abandoned their dignity and would resort to the lowest of activities to obtain a small sum of money just to get high. Women who used the drug while pregnant were at risk of permanently damaging the developing central nervous system of the fetus, resulting in later behavioral issues and learning disabilities. It also increased the chances of women having stillborn and premature births, and the press coined the term to describe those born to addict mothers. But the predicament of addicts and the destruction it heaped on communities was of no concern to dealers and traffickers, as the plight of users translated into economic prosperity for them. But no matter how careful, disciplined, and diligent a kingpin is, their reigns at the pinnacle of the drug game proved to be short-lived, and Yayo's time as the undisputed crack king of New York was coming to a close. As agents compiled evidence from their investigations with the help of informants, they were tipped off to the whereabouts of Yayo's drug manufacturing apartments. In May of 1987, they raided his headquarters at 2400 Webb Avenue and 2623 Sedgwick Avenue in the Kingsbridge Heights neighborhood of the Bronx. There they confiscated 50 pounds of pure cocaine, an arsenal of automatic weapons, bulletproof vests, 100,000 empty vials, a gas mask, and numerous people were arrested. Yayo happened to be in New York City at the time of the raid, but he had long been prepared for this day to come, and when he became aware of the events unfolding, he was ready to act. When authorities began closing in on him, he narrowly avoided arrest, then immediately headed to the airport and fled back to the Dominican Republic with a fake passport. Also joining him were his mother, sister, and 3 brothers, and once settled in DR, they were out of harm's way, as the country had no extradition treaty with the US at the time. While Yayo and his family were safe in their homeland, more and more baseballs dealers were being arrested in New York, and although the operation may have been greatly hindered, it was still generating money for the time being. But even while the heat was coming down on his organization, Yayo wasn't ready to concede the American business that he built from scratch and was intent on running it remotely. He tried to control things from DR by using armed enforcers in New York to police the activities of his workers and also to drive away the competition. He and his brother Cheeky were being fed a steady stream of money from their drug business through the currency exchange that they owned. But Yayo couldn't exert the same amount of authority over his business nor elicit the same amount of fear in his employees from 1,500 miles away. And due to this, many of his dealers began claiming street corners as their own and keeping the profits for themselves. When Yayo discovered this, he sent 2 hitmen to New York to take care of the dissidents, but the DEA was tipped off to this plan. The hired killers headed to a building in the Bronx where they planned to eliminate 4 Puerto Rican drug dealers, but they were being tailed by agents. When the hitmen arrived at the location, they pulled an Uzi on their intended targets, but before they could get off any shots, the gun jammed, and agents immediately intervened and arrested them. Yayo's attempts to control his business from afar proved ineffectual, and his drug enterprise quickly began to unravel. Even his hitmen were in conflict with each other. While the two were out on bail, one shot the other dead over an argument. After months of investigation, on July 30th, 1987, United States Attorney Rudolph Giuliani signed a new 58-count federal indictment against Yayo, his 5 family members, and 23 others. Yayo's charges included drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. While his hit squad was believed to be responsible for at least 5 slayings, there wasn't enough evidence to bring charges. Of the 29 people indicted, authorities had rounded up 16, 12 remained at large, and one defendant, Yayo's hitman, was dead. Yayo's first partner, Roberto Capo Mejia, was already in custody and had his own legal issues to deal with, stemming from his arrest for running a baseball spot in Yonkers in December of 1986. Then the following week, on August 5th, 1987, the Ramos brothers' Lido ring was busted. The DEA stormed the building at 600 West 183rd Street, which was described as being one of the largest factories in Washington Heights. In one apartment, they recovered $200,000 worth of rocks and cocaine, as well as hundreds of packed vials. Then in another apartment, they discovered 2 pounds of rocks, a pound of cocaine, thousands of empty vials, and labels bearing the Lido brand name. Baseballs and its subsidiary Lido, which was the earliest and most prominent crack organization in New York City, had been permanently dismantled. In DR, the marketing genius behind the rise of those destructive glass vials in New York City was out of reach of American authorities. U.S. officials pressed the Dominican government to have Yayo sent back to face charges, but their insistence fell on deaf ears. By the time he escaped to the Dominican Republic, the 26-year-old Yayo may have already wired as much as $20 million in cash back to DR. His wealth was tremendous by any standards, but his money went even further in a less developed country like the Dominican Republic, and he wasn't shy about displaying his riches. Although not a flamboyant character, his taste for expensive things made his wealth more than apparent. He drove around Santiago in a rare 1950s Mercedes-Benz SL300 Gullwing Coupe, which was worth around $100,000 at the time, and sells for well over $1 million today. He continued opening up more businesses and building on an already impressive portfolio, while also fathering several children. One of the nightclubs he owned in Santiago, named Ambis Uno, quickly became a successful venue and was very popular amongst locals and tourists. But trouble soon made its way to Yayo. On one evening in 1988, while he was at a Santiago nightclub, he got into an argument with another man over a woman, which led to a gunfight between them. This resulted in Yayo being struck in the leg with a bullet, with varying accounts of what happened to the other man, with some stories alleging that he was killed by Yayo's gunfire. When the police arrived, Yayo was pistol whipped by a Dominican general and was taken straight to prison without even being afforded a trial. He was sent to La Victoria Penitentiary, just outside of Santo Domingo, to serve his sentence. It's the largest prison in the Dominican Republic and known to be an overcrowded and dangerous place with inhumane conditions. Yayo described La Victoria as being far worse than Rikers Island in New York, and that you had to pay the other inmates just to get a spot on the floor to sleep. While Yayo was beginning his prison term in DR, back in New York, the Ramos brothers were up against a mountain of evidence against them, and all 4 brothers chose to plead guilty to charges of conspiracy and cocaine dealing, resulting in varying sentences. 14 other members of the Lido organization pled guilty without trial, while 2 others had fled the country. By April of 1989, numerous members of Yayo's gang had been convicted of various crimes, including Capo, who was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. One of the police officers on the gang's payroll, Bernard Waters, was indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of racketeering and conspiracy for accepting payoffs from Yayo. In 1990, while Yayo was incarcerated at La Victoria, he got into a brawl with other inmates, and afterwards he was transferred to the Monte Plata prison. There, his time was much more comfortable as he exerted his influence over the prison guards and received such perks as the use of a cell phone, ordering takeout from restaurants, and getting a TV in his prison cell. But soon Yayo found himself in yet another altercation with inmates after he intervened to prevent the rape of a female prisoner, and afterwards the inmates tried to burn him alive by setting the cot in his prison cell on fire. While Yayo was dealing with his own issues in DR, back in the US, a trend of Dominican gangs who were involved in the cocaine and crack trade in and around New York City were taking over where Yayo left off. This included the Wild Cowboys, which was led by Yayo's former subordinates Lenny Sepulveda and his brother Nelson, and Yayo's old associate Franklin Cuevas was also a member. They were dominating the market in the South Bronx and parts of the Heights, pulling in over $1 million a month. The gang was known for their ruthlessness and extreme violence and were alleged to have been responsible for dozens of murders. Another was La Compania, led by José Chelo Montalvo, which was a large and highly structured enterprise which operated in the Heights as well as East New York, Brooklyn, and paid the notorious corrupt cop of the 75th Precinct, Michael Dowd, $8,000 a week to protect their organization. Then there was the Jheri Curl gang of the Heights, which was led by the 5 Martinez brothers. Named after the hairstyle that all the gang members wore, they ran a cocaine operation out of buildings on West 157th Street and eliminated anyone who threatened their business. Then came DDP, Dominicans Don't Play, who would soon spread around all 5 boroughs and outside of New York. 1991 was a particularly violent year for the drug trade in Washington Heights. There were a total of 122 murders, with 97 of them being Dominicans. 80 of them were killed by guns, and 54 of those murders were confirmed to be carried out by drug gang members, most of which were hitmen brought to New York. As mid-1992 came around in the Heights, the area was still at its peak of drug activity and violence. Information provided by the DNCD, the Dominican National Directorate of Drug Control, indicated that between January and August of 1992, a total of 144 bodies were flown back to the Dominican Republic from the US, with all of the deceased suffering violent deaths. The DNCD statistics also revealed that 15% of them were 18 to 20 years old, 70% were between 21 and 35, and 15% were 36 or older. Based on the locations of their burial sites, it was determined that 57% of those killed hailed from Santo Domingo, 29% of them came from San Francisco de Macorís, and the rest were from various other locations in DR, including Santiago. After a total of 4 years of incarceration, in 1992, Yayo was released from prison and went back to expanding his Dominican business empire. Yayo spent the next year earning the favor of his countrymen by setting up a program to feed poor children and placing trash cans on street corners. By the mid-90s, Yayo's portfolio included a hotel with a casino connected to it, beachfront condos, several nightclubs, another hotel, banana fields, and a clothing factory. Being a multi-millionaire mogul still only in his early 30s, he enjoyed a life of opulence. He wore the finest clothes, had a fleet of luxury cars, and owned several homes, one of which was this elegant house in Santiago, surrounded by trees. Now the father of 5 children, he focused on managing his businesses, woke up early every morning to take his kids to school, and spent time working out in his private gym. Yayo had laid the blueprint and became the prototype for Dominican organized crime in the US, with other Dominican hustlers modeling their ventures like his and formulating similar backup plans. While Dominican drug gang members made illegal money in the US, they invested it in real estate and businesses back home in DR in preparation to return in the event of prosecution. If they were lucky enough to dodge an arrest or be granted bail, they simply fled back home where they already had revenue streams and money stored. There they could live comfortably off their riches and never face punishment for their crimes in the US. But American authorities didn't simply forget about Yayo. In 1996, the New York Police Commissioner Howard Safir traveled to Santo Domingo to meet with the president, Leonel Fernandez. He urged Fernandez to change his country's extradition laws so Dominican criminals could be returned to the US and face justice. However, Fernandez called the request absurd and totally impossible, and decades later, Polanco Rodriguez has still not answered for his American crimes. Also in 1996, Yayo was interviewed in DR by a reporter from the New York Times newspaper. He said that he had retired from a life of crime, and US and Dominican officials had no evidence to contradict that. He lamented that he has done so much for his community, but was never thanked by his compatriots or the government. In the interview, he stated that he doesn't allow anyone to call him Yayo anymore because that is, quote, the name of some monster. He said that he doesn't drink or smoke and never cheats on his wife, and wants his children to know the difference between good and evil. He admitted that he wasn't a saint and broke down in tears while speaking. He also claimed that due to a concussion he suffered in a motorcycle accident, that he has forgotten many of the crimes he committed. He professed his love for New York City and said he would give anything to go back and send his kids to Harvard. His sidekick, Capo, served his time and was released. His present status and whereabouts are unknown. By the end of the 1990s, crack had been de-escalated from an epidemic, and by the early 2000s, the era of savage crack-dealing gangs and areas overrun with addicts no longer plagued communities nationwide like it once did. The decline was due to a few factors, including law enforcement efforts, the ominous and low-class reputation connected to it, and simply that it had lost its appeal and other drugs became more popular, including powdered cocaine, which saw a resurgence. But even today, the trail of destruction those small white rocks left behind is still felt to some extent in many communities across America. In 2006, Yayo shut down his acclaimed nightclub, Ambis Uno. The club's business was seriously affected by a presidential decree which reduced the hours of sales for alcoholic beverages, so he had to close its doors after 20 years of operation. Yayo spent the next years ostensibly as a businessman and family man who had put his criminal past behind him and gained a well-respected reputation amongst his comrades. He's donated money to charities, hospitals, and foster homes, and has been hailed by many for his generous contributions. He also continued a dedicated fitness routine and could be spotted by locals jogging or riding his bicycle around Santiago. In 2015, the Dominican Republic's laws had changed, and President Fernandez signed an extradition treaty with the US. Then in 2020, the presidency changed and DR is now led by Luis Abinader. But even under the new president, Yayo's prominent standing in the community, which likely includes some strong political connections, has kept him in favor with leaders of the country, and it seems improbable that he will ever be extradited. Polanco Rodriguez, better known as Yayo, is alive and well at 63 years old. He's still younger than the average American's retirement age, yet has already spent decades living with all the riches, assets, and financial freedom that most people could only dream of. US officials will likely never get the chance to charge him for earning millions of dollars of illicit money and playing a pivotal role in setting off possibly the worst drug epidemic in US history. Yayo possesses a business savvy, which he applied to both the legal and illegal worlds, and may have been capable of becoming wealthy without even needing to sell drugs. But like many kids from the hood who are driven to improve their social and financial standings, he was influenced by his surroundings and used that ambition on the wrong side of the law. It's now been almost 40 years since he was the mastermind of the mass marketing of crack in New York, and the origins of the city's epidemic can be traced back to this very block in Washington Heights, where his empire began taking shape in 1985. Some will only see him as Santiago Luis Polanco Rodriguez, nothing more than a ruthless, violent criminal who profited off the addiction of others and popularized the substance which brought immeasurable devastation to many neighborhoods, including his own. While others will see him as Yayo, the savvy hustler who earned millions from an American drug empire, which allowed him to create another empire of businesses in the Dominican Republic and escape both death and punishment for his drug crimes to live a life of luxury in plain sight as one of the most successful kingpins of all time and one of the very few who played the game and won.